What's good? It's Wood. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Maurice Hooker, 27 wins, 2 losses, and 3 draws, taking on Blair the Flair Cobbs. 15 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw. This is Maurice Hooker's return to the ring, first fight since getting stopped by Vergil Ortiz in March of 2021. Hooker has actually lost 2 of his last 3 fights, and both of those losses came via stoppage, both by then Robert Garcia trained fighters as well. It was Jose Ramirez, where Jose Ramirez unified 2 of the 4 belts at 140 by stopping Hooker. This was in July of 2019. And those were the 2 belts that Ramirez would then carry into that battle for undisputed against Josh Taylor. But Ramirez stopped Hooker in the 6th round, and then 2 fights later for Hooker, after he had moved from 140 to 147, got stopped by Vergil Ortiz Jr. And his opponent, Blair Cobbs, it's kind of one of those situations where the person's like mouth and their persona is kind of tracking them faster than I think they normally would, just based on skills and resume alone. Not to say that Blair Cobbs isn't a good or talented fighter. He, like Maurice Hooker, is a latecomer to boxing, relative latecomer, and has actually achieved pretty damn good success given those circumstances. Now, Blair Cobbs just suffered his first professional loss, and that was against Alexis Rocha. And that was when Cobbs versus Rocha was elevated to the main event, when the fight between the originally scheduled fight between Vergil Ortiz Jr. and Michael McKinson was canceled or postponed because of Vergil Ortiz's undisclosed medical issue. So now they're actually rescheduling that, and this Maurice Hooker versus Blair Cobbs fight is on the rescheduled Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Michael McKinson fight. It's on the undercard of that main event. But yeah, earlier this year, March of 2022, Blair Cobbs suffered his first professional loss against Alexis Rocha. He got stopped in the 9th round, knocked out. It was a pretty tough fight, and you know, he did have a lot of good moments. Alexis Rocha has only one defeat himself, and that was to Rashidi Ellis a couple of years ago. So Alexis Rocha is one of the better fighters on Golden Boy. I'd say he's probably next after Vergil Ortiz Jr., Ryan Garcia, then Jaime Munguia. You know, right around that Jojo Diaz, Alexis Rocha, up and coming at 147. But yeah, Maurice Hooker versus Blair Cobbs is interesting because traditionally I would have said that Hooker is coming in as the more proven and the better overall fighter. But when you look a little bit closer, Blair Cobbs wouldn't be very far off, especially when you consider Maurice Hooker's very limited success at 147. Now, if this was like 140, yeah, Maurice Hooker was seen to be an elite fighter, former belt holder after beating Terry Flanagan, a former lightweight champion. They were fighting for one of the vacant titles at 140. This was after Terrence Crawford cleaned out, I wouldn't say he cleaned out, he won all of the belts, he became undisputed, and then he basically just dropped all of the belts when he pursued 147. So in the wake of the Terrence Crawford domination at 140, Maurice Hooker picked up one of those belts in a vacant title fight against Terry Flanagan. I still see that to be the best win of Maurice Hooker's career. Flanagan was a favorite at the time, and this took place in Great Britain, Manchester Arena, so the crowd was super pro Terry Flanagan, the broadcast was pro Terry Flanagan, and Maurice Hooker from Dallas, Texas went out to the UK and beat Flanagan for that vacant belt. So since then, he's beaten Alex Salcedo, Mikel Slick Mick LaPierre. Those were Hooker's 2 successful title defenses of his WBO 140-pound belt, and then he fought Jose Ramirez for the unification fight where Ramirez put up his WBC belt and ended up taking Maurice Hooker's WBO belt. And it was one of those fights where Hooker was looking pretty decent, you know, when he was able to keep the fight in the center of the ring. He's got very long arms. Surprisingly, Blair Cobbs is actually a little bit taller than Maurice Hooker. Think about that. I always, in my head, envision Blair Cobbs being kind of like 5'9", 5'10"-ish, but no. Maurice Hooker's 5'11", and Blair Cobbs is listed at 5'11 and a half. So what would usually be an advantage for Maurice Hooker in terms of height, he doesn't necessarily have that here. He still has a significant reach advantage. That's just because Maurice Hooker's arms, even in relation to his 5'11 frame, are very, very long reach. I mean, some sources have him listed with a 80-inch reach. Now, I've seen him fight where his declared fight reach was listed at less than 80 inches. But if you look at like Wikipedia, BoxRec, it's listed at 80 inches. So I don't know what the official is, but he's got a significant reach advantage, even given his 5'11" height. But he was able to use that somewhat successfully against Jose Ramirez. Again, as long as he was able to keep it in the middle of the ring. His corner was basically urging him after the third and fourth round, keep your damn back off the ropes, because he would find himself against the ropes. And imagine, that's like the last place you need to be against a fighter like Jose Ramirez, a patient pressure fighter. I wouldn't even say that patient. I mean, he's a pressure fighter. There are definitely more patient pressure fighters out there, but he's looking to pretty much pin you up against the ropes at a certain point and let his power punches go. He's pretty good in the middle of the ring as well, which you could see that in his fights against, Jose Zepeda down the stretch and against Jose Pedraza most recently. And even in a lot of the rounds against Josh Taylor, Jose Ramirez was very good in the middle of the ring. But he was having some difficulty with Hooker early in the fight, but then again, he would basically kind of slowly work Hooker over to where he was able to get him against the ropes, would then unleash with devastating punches to the body, not too dissimilar from some of the power punches to the body that Vergil Ortiz was throwing. I do see Ortiz as being a slightly better fighter. Not only is he up a division, but I see him as being a slightly better technical fighter than Jose Ramirez, maybe even more than slightly. Like Vergil Ortiz, I look at him as being pretty cream of the crop in the way that he works his jab and he goes to the body, but mostly because of Ortiz's effective use of the jab. But yeah, Jose Ramirez was able to pin Hooker up against the ropes, ended up finishing him in the 6th round. That is probably, I would say that's Jose Ramirez's best win to date. You could argue that it's Zepeda or even Pedraza. I still think it's his title unification win against Maurice Hooker. But then Hooker went up to 147, was back in the ring within like 6 months, and he ended up beating Uriel Perez in the 1st round. It was a 1st round TKO. So you're not able to gauge like too well how acclimated to the new weight class Hooker is with the 1st round knockout, but it is a good result. You can't argue with that. But then he fought Vergil Ortiz Jr. immediately after that, like maybe 3 months after that win. And again, he had his moments in the early rounds, but watching the fight, you got the feeling that it was only a matter of time before Vergil Ortiz's jab and his blasting punches to the body, just his pressure style of fighting and his level changing, just all the ingredients that make for Vergil Ortiz's winning recipe. You had the feeling that they were eventually going to break Maurice Hooker. And it's kind of hard to explain, but I almost feel that Maurice Hooker, especially at 147, just doesn't have the bodily constitution to be able to withstand some of the more punishing blows from some of the most punishing punchers in the division. Vergil Ortiz Jr. is nothing less than one of the more devastating punchers at 147. So, like he did against Jose Ramirez, Maurice Hooker eventually broke down against Vergil Ortiz Jr., ended up getting injured to either the hand or the shoulder as well. Maybe it was even the elbow, but it looked like it was caused by a Vergil Ortiz punch to Maurice Hooker's arm as he was looking to finish the fight, because he had dropped him badly in the 6th round and then came out with a head full of steam in the 7th round. Ortiz did. And so he ended up dropping Maurice Hooker and then just kind of breaking him off to the arm, injuring Hooker. Hooker turned around and went to a knee, and that was pretty much the end of the fight. So again, Hooker is coming off of 2 out of 3 stoppage losses in his last 3 fights. And now he's fighting Blair the Flair Cobbs, who's, again, his personality has been so loud. And he's been almost Rolly Romero-like in the way that he's calling out names that you kind of know he has no business calling out. Like, in the days leading up to Blair Cobbs versus Alexis Rocha, the fight where Blair Cobbs lost via 9th round knockout in a 10-round fight, Blair Cobbs was calling out like Errol Spence Jr. So a lot of the cream of the crop, like when you see Rolly Romero and the way that he was calling out Gervonta Davis, most people didn't take Rolly Romero that seriously. In the same vein, they're not really taking Blair Cobbs that seriously. And now that he's been stopped by Alexis Rocha, who, might end up being an elite fighter. By the way, he's the brother of Ronnie Rios, Alexis Rocha is. But we don't know how good Rocha's going to be. He just won another fight on the Ryan Garcia versus Javier Fortuna undercard. He didn't look sensational, but but he did look dominant. He just wasn't able to stop his opponent. But Rocha might end up being an elite fighter, a proven elite fighter. He's looking very good. Can't yet say great. We'll see. But Blair Cobbs was having his moments, was basically trying to move around the ring, and he likes to move around and then throw like ambush style hard left hands. He's a southpaw, Blair Cobbs is. So he'll throw like 2-3 punch combinations, and then he'll get on the move again. He'll kind of change levels. He's got kind of like that curly afro. So every move that he makes, his hair is like moving with it, which I feel like it works, you know, against you more than it works for you when you've got a lot of hair that's kind of flopping around as you're fighting. Because, and I think I said this in, you know, a live chat several weeks ago, but I felt like, and I felt the same way when Jermell Charlo was fighting Brian Castano in the rematch, a fight that I attended in Carson, California. But I feel like fighters who have a lot of hair, even Manny Pacquiao, you know, when he had his longer kind of orangish, you know, the dyed hair, like when you're getting hit, even if it's not like a super effective punch, the hair is flopping around in a way where it looks like something's happening. It looks like some impact is being had when your hair is flopping around. Either you're getting hit or you're on the move and you don't look steady. And it's just an optical illusion because like it's not all fighters have super long hair that's moving around like that, but it's just visually attracting the eye when hair is flopping around. So that's something that I couldn't help but like pick up on. But I was trying not to pay any attention to it. But, you know, you have Blair Cobbs exchanging in these combinations against Alexis Rocha, and then he would start moving again. And while he's getting hit, even while he's throwing the punch, his hair is like moving around. It just looks dramatic. And you would think that you would want to make the judges think that you are as steady as possible. So I just don't think that having a bunch of hair moving around is advantageous as it pertains to the crowd, the viewing audience, or the judges. But Blair Cobbs was fighting pretty well. He's an athletic puncher. He's a pretty athletic mover. He doesn't have the most disciplined style. Like he tends to get a little bit, not even a little bit reckless, but sometimes he'll get involved in an actual street fight in the middle of the ring. Like he likes to throw. And that works when you are clearly more talented than the opponent. But when you're then facing a power puncher like Alexis Rocha, who I still don't necessarily think, I don't think Alexis Rocha is as good as Vergil Ortiz Jr., and I'm not sure yet if he's as good as Jose Ramirez, but I know that these are two guys that Maurice Hooker's already been in there with. Granted, he lost via stoppage to both guys. So when I was first seeing that this fight was announced, initially I was thinking Maurice Hooker's the higher class fighter. But then I'm thinking, well, what has he really shown me at 147? He's got 2 fights, 1 first-round knockout, and a stoppage loss to one of the best in the division, and one of the more destructive forces as I see it in all of boxing. I really have a lot of admiration for Vergil Ortiz Jr. And, you know, my dream contender fight, I hope, obviously, Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford happens, but it's not going to happen, but I would really love a contender fight between Boots Ennis and Vergil Ortiz Jr. I actually issued out a poll on who you think would win between the two, and I think it was like, you know, 60-something% to maybe 30-something%. 60-something% were saying, you know, Boots, and maybe 30-something, 35% was saying Vergil Ortiz Jr. So, you know, it was a competitive vote, and I know for promotional reasons and just career trajectory, and we'll call it career management reasons, I wouldn't see a fight like that happening, not to mention the networks, you know, Oscar and DAZN and then PBC Showtime. I just don't see Boots versus Vergil happening. But in an ideal boxing environment, in an ideal boxing universe, that fight happens. And they're both like in their early 20s too. But yeah, Maurice Hooker got stopped by Vergil Ortiz Jr. and Jose Ramirez. So I expect this to actually be I think that Maurice Hooker's jab, I would like to think, you know, given his experience and him having more experience than Blair Cobbs and having to just, you know, fight a disciplined style fight, for instance, against the likes of Terry Flanagan. Granted, this is a former lightweight champ that he was fighting in Terry Flanagan. And again, that was even at 140 while he was fighting Flanagan and when he had most of his successes against LePierre, Salcedo, Cristobal Cruz, and so forth. So I'm kind of reevaluating how I'm looking at Hooker versus Cobbs. Like, I see Cobbs as being a talented puncher. He's coming off a loss, but he's a pretty brave and daring fighter. And he stopped Brad Solomon, who is crazy. Brad Solomon is a former, prospect himself who, once he started losing, they started serving him up against like Vergil Ortiz, and he got stopped by Ortiz. And then in his very next fight, he gets matched against Alexis Rocha. You could say that's another good opportunity, right? I mean, Oscar De La Hoya is giving Brad Solomon a lot of paydays, but damn, like in terms of the level of competition that he's having to fight, going from Ortiz getting stopped to Alexis Rocha losing via decision. 2 fights later, he got knocked out in like the early rounds against Blair Cobbs. So Blair Cobbs is one of the last guys to stop Brad Solomon, and that was actually Cobbs' last fight before fighting Alexis Rocha. But I think that Maurice Hooker's jab's going to make a big difference. I do think that Hooker's going to get caught with some clean Blair Cobbs left hands. But damn, this is actually more and more interesting the more I think about it. Like a part of me, like my mind still wants to say Maurice Hooker is the better, more well-rounded boxer, but he's fighting a pretty athletic, true 147 guy who is a shade taller than him, at least in terms of their official heights. They're both right around 5'11", so what was normally a advantage that Hooker was enjoying, he's not going to have the same advantage. But again, this is looking like it's also an 80-inch reach to 73-inch reach advantage for Maurice Hooker. So again, I think Hooker's going to be able to control a lot of the action with the jab. I think Blair Cobbs is going to muddy things up with a lot of violent exchanges. That's how I would describe Blair Cobbs' punching style. He's a pretty aggressive and violent puncher, and he could be, again, a little bit of a wild man in there. And he's got an interesting background. Like his dad was like a fugitive for some time, so he went out to like Guadalajara, Mexico, where Blair Cobbs like grew up for a lot of his childhood. His birthplace was like Philadelphia. But yeah, very interesting background for Blair Cobbs. But I think that he is going to look good and look dangerous in a lot of these exchanges where he goes from moving around to like, trying to feint his way in to start throwing power punches on Hooker. Hooker, I expect to be the steadier hand in the ring. I think Hooker's going to be cognizant and I think he'll be attacking to the body. Like Hooker has to make the body attack a part of his strategy against Cobbs here. The question is, if you've got a competitive first half of the fight, and I believe that this is a 10-rounder, who is going to be stronger in the second half of the fight? And it's like, Cobbs doesn't have terrible endurance issues. Maurice Hooker's obviously gone the distance. I mean, his win over Terry Flanagan was via split decision in a 12-rounder. Blair Cobbs has won one 10-round decision, so he's gone the full 10 once, and that was against Samuel Cote, and I forgot how to pronounce his last name, Nikwe. But yeah, that was a 10-round split decision win for Blair Cobbs. But, I actually think that this is going to be a very action-packed fight because Maurice Hooker lets his hands go as well, like way more than he should probably be advised at doing. What I mean by that is he kind of gives up his height sometimes. Sometimes when he remembers to stay behind the jab and to maintain the range, he'll do so. But more often than not, he seems to get dragged into a lot of not totally phone booth style fights, but fights that involve a lot of up-close exchanges to where they're both breaking each other off to the body, throwing 3 to 4 punch combinations, mixing it up high and low. So I think there are going to be a lot of moments between Hooker and Cobbs. My question is, who's going to be the more likely, first of all, to get shaky legged? Who's more likely to get clipped in those exchanges? And if nobody gets knocked down, who's going to start overwhelming the other with activity? Basically, who's going to be the more voluminous and busier fighter? I think that might still end up being Maurice Hooker. He's just been in a lot of fights where it required him to dig deep and throw a lot of punches. Granted, he has now twice come on the losing end of an attrition style fight, but I think that he is likely going to win, I would say, a split decision style victory over Blair Cobbs. I think that this could also be a draw. I don't want to go another draw. And I don't want to not pick a draw because I recently picked a draw. Like if I think this is going to be a draw, I want to say, yeah, I think it's going to be like a split draw style of fight. But I had picked Joet Gonzalez and Isaac Dogboe to result in a draw. It was close to being a draw, and it ended up being a close decision win for Dogboe. But in this fight, I could see it being a draw, but I'm going to go with a split decision or a very close, like 6-4 style win for Maurice Hooker over Blair Cobbs. Another possibility here, by the way, is that the fight gets stopped due to a cut. Like, I think that there might be some bad head clashes because they both will jump in with power punches, especially Blair Cobbs. And Blair Cobbs being a southpaw, Maurice Hooker being orthodox, I can see, Maurice Hooker throwing jabs and trying to like throw hard right hands to the body, which he also does pretty well to, continue to maintain range. He'll throw a jab and he'll kind of do that jab to the body, but he'll also throw a nice right hand to the body. Blair Cobbs, I look to him staying on the outside and then jumping in. Again, jumping in with hard left hands and also hard right hooks. So there's a high likelihood that they could clash heads to where it opens up a cut. But I think that this is going to be a very close fight to call, and I think there are going to be a few swing rounds because Blair Cobbs does have high output, and he does look good when he's throwing those hard combinations, and he's a pretty damn accurate puncher as well. But he gets a little bit wild. I think Maurice Hooker is going to be able to find opportunities to change angles and continue to work to the body, and I think that he's going to get the slight advantage in the scorecards against Blair Cobbs. So I see a close decision win for Maurice Hooker. But again, this could be stopped due to a head clash, and it could also result in a potential draw. I don't see Blair Cobbs getting the decision win, but that also could be my lack of consideration to how unproven Maurice Hooker is at 147. I could be overlooking that. Maybe he cannot hang and durability wise with a true 147 pounder. I mean, he's had a couple years to work into it now. He hasn't fought at 140 since that 2019 loss to Jose Ramirez. But if you can't take shots up top reliably and shots to the body, if you basically can't withstand some of the more grueling fights, then you will lose to a Vergil Ortiz Jr. or a Jose Ramirez. I don't know if Blair Cobbs is exactly the type of fighter who will be able to exploit a potential lack of durability for Maurice Hooker. Not to say that Cobbs doesn't hit hard, like 10 out of his 15 wins have come via knockout, but I just don't think that he can necessarily knock out a near elite fighter, even if that fighter isn't a elite 147 pounder just bodily wise. But yeah, I'm going to still go with Maurice Hooker via decision. Let me know what you think about this fight. I think this was an interesting fight announcement. I'm pretty intrigued to see how this one plays out. Maurice Hooker, again, former belt holder at 140. And, this is kind of a must win for him. Like, I think that this is, both guys really want to win this. But I feel like with the narrative of Maurice Hooker's career, you don't want to lose 3 out of your last 4 fights. But yeah, let me know what you think about Hooker versus Cobbs in the comments. Who do you see winning this fight and how? And please, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.